everyone. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day today. Thank you for taking the time to listen in on today's podcast of Mindbending Microbiology, where my goal is to share with you some of the most fascinating facts of the microbial world. Today's episode will focus on the question, what are virulence mechanisms? You may have heard in the previous episode that we have extraordinary bacteria and other microorganisms in our gut microbiome, or the digestive tract. These organisms do not cause disease, but rather help us to digest food among other organisms. In fact, according to the NIH, microorganisms make up 1 to 3% of our body mass, and we have over 39 trillion microorganisms in our bodies that are not specifically human cells, and they help us to survive. Your first thought to learning about the microorganisms in the world may be, wait, why is the common cold easier to get over than a disease such as pneumonia? What determines the severity of the symptoms? Or what makes something a really good pathogen against humans? These are all really great questions, but sadly I won't be able to explore all of them in the podcast. But first, let us start with some definition. Pathogenicity is the ability of an organism to cause disease to a host. And virulence is a term used to describe how severe the symptoms are when it does cause a disease. Virulence factors essentially help a pathogen or organism that causes disease to invade the host defenses, cause the disease, and ultimately try to evade the host defenses. An example of a highly virulent group of organisms that you may have heard about is Streptococcus pneumoniae, or organisms that cause pneumococcal diseases such as pneumonia and bloodstream infections. However, some of these species only cause minor sinus and ear infections. What makes a bacterium able to cause such a deadly disease in humans? In this podcast, we are going to explore the virulence mechanisms of bacteria and how these features of bacteria can help it to cause disease. We will be exploring adherence factors, capsules, and toxins in this podcast. But I encourage you to research on your own what other characteristics a bacteria may have that can help it to cause disease in humans. Our first virulence factor is adherence factors. Adherence factors allow the bacterium to stick or adhere to the host that they are infecting. Why might this be advantageous for the bacteria? If the bacteria is able to stick to the host cells, that gives it more time to invade the host cells and possibly inject terrible things known as toxins into it. Some examples that bacteria may have as adherence factors include pili, which are short, hair-like structures on the cell surface of bacteria. You may think that the pili are primarily involved in movement, but they also have the function of adhering to the surface of cells such as our own to cause disease. Scary, right? The thought of a pathogenic bacteria clinging onto your host cells. Okay, so now that we have covered adherence factors such as pili, we will now explore the role of capsules in causing disease. You can imagine that when something like a foreign pathogenic bacteria enters the body, your immune system wants to kill it immediately. Your body definitely does not like having something that causes disease, and the presence of these bacteria causes sort of a red flag, where your body's like, hey, get rid of that thing, kill it. Your immune system acts by trying to essentially eat the bacteria, a process called phagocytosis. Well, bacteria have a defense mechanism against phagocytosis. We can imagine the capsule as a protective layer of polysaccharides, or layer of sugars, that is just outside the cell envelope. More simply, we can imagine it as armor against the immune system. So basically, the capsule does not necessarily have a direct role in causing disease, but rather an indirect role in protecting it from death in the immune system, so that it can use other virulence mechanisms to cause disease. The last virulence mechanism that we will explore today is one of the most fascinating to me, toxins. When we think of the word toxins, we're most likely thinking of something that we should not ingest that could kill us. Like, we should not ingest cleaning products, that's toxic. In the microbial world, the definition is about the same, but we had two types, endotoxins and exotoxins. Endo meaning inside and exo meaning outside for simplicity. Endotoxins are lipopolysaccharides, lipo meaning fat, polysaccharide meaning multiple sugars, that are on the outer membrane of bacteria known as gram-negative bacteria. This essentially means that they have this outer layer of peptidoglycan in the outer membrane. I highly suggest looking at a picture of this. If enough of the endotoxins from the cell membrane of these gram-negative bacteria enter the human bloodstream, they can cause fever, shock, which is a lack of blood flow or perfusion to the body, and organ failure. These endotoxins are causing an inflammatory response from the host, or you. Your body, again, does not like the presence of these foreign invaders and wants to get rid of them quickly. A fever that you may get from an infection is your body trying to kill off the bacteria and to possibly stop it from producing these endotoxins. Now that we know a little bit more about endotoxins, what are exotoxins? They are essentially these proteins that are released from the bacterial cell instead of being in the cell membrane. Now, it does not have to be gram-negative. It could also be a gram-positive cell, meaning it has this thick layer of peptidoglycan in the cell wall. But what is its difference on an effect on the body? I mentioned that endotoxins can cause these systematic responses such as fever or sepsis. The exotoxins are more localized and really only affect certain types of cells. Now, there are so many types of exotoxins that I can make a whole nother episode about, but I think you get the picture. From our analogy earlier, we can maybe think of toxins as our swords or weapons, with the capsules providing the shield and the adherence factors acting as a ship that can get us to our enemy and keep us there. Now, imagine a bacteria that causes disease that has adherence factors that can attach to the host cells and the ability to produce endotoxins and exotoxins that harm the hosts. Not only can they attack, but they can also defend themselves against the host's immune system with the capsule. Let's look at a real-world example of a bacterium that causes disease. Our first example is Vibrio cholerae, the organism that causes cholera. Cholera has symptoms such as watery diarrhea, vomiting, thirst, etc., that often leads to death by dehydration. What is one of the virulence mechanisms that Vibrio cholerae has that makes it cause disease? Essentially, it can attach to the intestinal mucosa, or the lining of the intestinal tract, and release exotoxins. Specifically, Vibrio cholerae releases a type of exotoxin called enterotoxins, which stimulate the body to excrete a lot of water and electrolytes, hence leading to the vomiting and the watery diarrhea. Let's look at another example. Our second example is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, or the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis in humans. Tuberculosis symptoms include feelings of weakness, weight loss, night sweats, coughing. If tuberculosis is not treated, it can be fatal. Not only can it affect the lungs, but it can infect the kidneys, spine, and the brain, according to the CDC. Although not entirely related to the topic of this podcast, it is still important to mention that tuberculosis is one of the leading causes of death in developing countries and clearly shows the healthcare disparities that exist in the world today. 7% of all deaths are attributed to tuberculosis in developing countries, making it the leading cause of death for a single source of infection among adults. Now, why is tuberculosis so deadly? Interestingly, Mycobacterium tuberculosis is able to evade the immune system. Their cellular surface allows them not to be eaten by those phagocytic cells mentioned earlier. They actually grow and multiply inside of the cells that are supposed to eat them. What an interesting virulence mechanism. You can imagine how hard it will be to develop a therapy for something that is living in your own cells without hurting your own. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to today's episode of Mindbending Microbiology. Hopefully you learned some pretty interesting ways that bacteria can cause disease in humans. Again, I encourage you to look into these topics on your own time. What do you think the most toxic virulence mechanism is? How can we protect ourselves against them? How are bacterial mechanisms different from viral virulence mechanisms? These might be some topics you might want to look into if you're up to it. Please let me know what topics interest you or a topic that you would like me to dive into further. I'm always open to suggestions. And also disclaimer, I have linked some of the sources for today's topic in the comments section of this podcast. Thank you all, and I hope everyone has a safe and wonderful day. As you walk around today outside to either work or your classes, think about all the incredible things nature does that are naked to the human eye. It is truly mind-bending.